Hi, good morning, everybody. So I hope you're excited about today's topic. I am. We're going to be talking about APIs. Yes. So just get my Zoom windows organized here. Okay, so to open this up, just at a very high level, APIs are rules that apps use to communicate with each other. We've been doing a lot of communicating as a human user with an app and just looking at that interaction, and APIs are a way to open that up so that multiple apps can actually share information, and we have like a lot that we can do with that new tool. So we'll mostly be focusing on web-based APIs for now, because that's it's what we're going to be using. You have an opportunity to get a lot of practice with web-based APIs in Mod 3 especially, and generally they're so common that when people just talk about APIs in passing, we can usually assume that we're talking about web-based APIs. And we can also think of these as the format that HTTP requests and applications accept and return. So there are a couple of blog posts and or articles and a video in the lesson plan that's linked in the calendar. And I'd like everybody to take about 10 to 15 minutes to read and watch those individually, and then we'll come back together and discuss. So yeah, we'll come back at 9:15. Okay, hopefully everybody had a good amount of time to work through that material and think about it a little bit. I would like to chat about it as a group before we move on. I'll take a volunteer for the first question. What do you think makes APIs so powerful, or why are they so useful to us as developers? Jake?
It looks like it pretty easily gives you functionality to a bunch of work other people have done, like their servers,
Yeah,
like access to more data.
it's a great point. We have access to more data if we have access to an API. Maybe somebody else has a database that they've built up and all this stuff that they're maintaining, and they've decided to share certain pieces of it with us, and we don't have to worry about going and repeating all that work. Cool, thank you. Anybody have anything else to add? Genevieve?
It provides a more seamless user experience so that when somebody is using your application, they don't have to go to other applications in order to perform an action.
Yeah, totally. Can take a lot of the work off of the user too. We might think of examples like logging in with a different app than the one we're using, or connecting Spotify to Facebook. There's so many real world examples, right? Kyle?
It creates like a standard or a protocol so that you can sort of build out the functionality for something once and then just continue to use that like API as the data gets updated.
Yeah, that's a good point too. If we're consuming an API, then we don't have to worry about storing that data somewhere, right? We can just trust the API to take care of it. Thanks. Jordan?
I think this kind of goes along with what a lot of the other people already said, but it seems like the API allows us to interact with APIs instead of having to go all the way to the web server and the database and like I don't say it saves us steps, but it kind of like in the same way like law Demeter kind of works, where like you're talking to less things. And there's kind of more specified stuff. You have less things to step through, I guess, in that way. I'm not sure if that's the right way of understanding it, but
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. There are probably going to be times when we're using APIs where we are able to like we kind of already talked about. But that's a good way of thinking about it. Like with the law of Demeter, the API can be responsible for the data that has to do with the API, and it doesn't have to clutter up anything else that our app is doing. Cool. Thanks, everybody. Those are all really good points. Let's see. Let's talk a little bit about JSON. What is JSON? And I will call on someone for this one. Jenny, what is JSON?
It's some kind of JavaScript interface. So I think it represents JavaScript objects.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, exactly. It represents JavaScript objects. JavaScript is a really common language for people to be using when they're developing or consuming APIs. And it's just kind of this agreed upon way for us to send data, receive data across HTTP requests that are API based, or they're applications talking to each other. Cool, thank you. Yeah, is that a thing? Is Jenny always first in these randomizers? Randomization is a difficult problem in computer science. Okay, cool. It's everybody. So let's look at a couple of ways that we can start to consume and look at APIs, a couple of examples of what the JSON would look like. In the lesson plan, there are a couple of examples here that we'll look at. The first one will take us to some GitHub API documentation. Y'all can see all of my screen, right? Okay, just making sure. So when we're looking at documentation for APIs, they might have little windows that show us an example response, right? So this is one example with a lot of data that we don't know much about. But here's another example that we can look at, just entering a URL in the browser. And our first hint here is that this domain is different. We have api.github.com and then some the rest of our URL, but a lot of APIs can be set up this way, and there will be today's lesson may bring up more questions about APIs and how we build them and how they're structured. There is a lot more content on that to come. I just want to throw that out there while I'm thinking about it. We're going to get some practice consuming APIs today. Just point out one little clue that this is what we're going to be looking at. And when I push enter here, if any of you had already experimented with this from the lesson plan, you see that this isn't, we get back this just data. We don't get back a web page like we would if we just went to github.com. We can look at it raw, we can look at it parsed, and it mentions it in the lesson plan, but I do recommend that folks add this JSON formatter extension to Chrome whenever you get a chance. So after looking at the documentation example here with we have committer, and committer has date, name, email, and each of those have their own values. Or looking at this more straightforward example here, what does this look like? Does this look like something that we've already worked with to any of y'all? And you can just shout it out if something comes to mind.
It's a hash.
Yeah, it looks just like a hash, right? We have our brackets that kind of signal that to us. We have key value pairs. And it's the neat thing about APIs, the thing that I think that is really cool about them is that a computer can understand this. Our applications are set up to understand this if they're set up to handle APIs. And we as humans can look at this and kind of get an idea of what is in this payload. It's pretty readable to us too. Okay, let's see. Yeah, and then we'll look at some similar examples. I just wanted to show a couple of ways that we can look at this data. We do have the browser, like we saw here. We also have this tool called curl, and this is something you can use in the command line. It's used to transfer data to or from a server, so you can get data by hitting an endpoint, is what we call these URLs. When we're working with APIs, you can hit this endpoint in curl and get some data back. And it's not entirely practical for saving the responses and working with it in your program, but it's a really useful tool for getting a quick glance at an API or checking to see if the call is working, making sure you're authenticated and all that stuff. So curl is a really useful tool for just beginning to explore APIs. And some of you may have heard of or used Postman. That's an application you can download that basically does the same thing curl does, but it's a lot more robust and neat and easy to follow and save your queries. But today we'll just be working with curl as like an introduction. So if I want to look in curl at a response, or if I want to hit an endpoint and get a response in curl, you can just come over to your terminal. And actually, I think what we'll do is use the example from the lesson plan. So here we can use this URL and go to the api.github.com again and put in /user/username. So that's what I'm going to do in my terminal. Just get rid of all this stuff. Let's see if that's all right. So here, right in the terminal, you can see that we have a really similar response to what we saw in the browser by using curl. That's another way that you can hit these endpoints. Okay. And then lastly, I wanted to go through an example of how we could do this with a Ruby file. And this is going to be the bulk of the work time is this lesson. I'm going to block in some time for everybody to experiment with this on their own, preferably using the web browser as well as curl as well as Ruby. So I thought we would walk through that Ruby example next. And the Ruby example should be very applicable to the project and future projects. We'll be using a gem called Faraday, which we'll use throughout the mod and in mod 3 and beyond. It's a really easy way to include API consumption and just working with APIs in your Rails projects. So in the lesson plan, we have this code snippet that you can, if you want to follow along, feel free, but we'll also have time to work on this individually. We can paste that in here, and just to kind of walk through it line by line before we dig in. The first thing is requiring that gem Faraday. It gives us some tools to basically do what curl is doing or what we're doing when we enter the API endpoint URL in our browser. And then we're requiring pry, and we're also requiring JSON so that when we get that JSON response back, we can manipulate it. Next thing that we're doing here on line 5 is we're calling Faraday.get. We're passing it a URL, and you all will want to replace this with a real username and just double check your URL to make sure that this is your username and it'll actually go somewhere. We're taking that response and we're assigning response.body to a variable, and we'll get into why. There's more that comes back in the response than just the body. So we're mostly interested in what's in the body, and we'll assign that to a variable. So we'll go through this, and I'll show a couple of things that I think would be valuable for everybody to experiment with and practice. But up to this point, does anybody have any questions? Okay, very cool. One second. All right, sorry, everybody. Let's see. So I'm going to go ahead and run this file. So we get to this binding.pry, and I'm just going to expand this a little bit, and let's take a look at what we're getting when we hit this endpoint. So if I have response, this returns to me a Faraday response object, and it has a lot of information, a lot of metadata, and stuff that we aren't necessarily interested in right away. We have a bunch of response headers, so that includes like the server and the date and the content type and just all this stuff. And then finally down here, we get to the response body. So I'm going to go ahead and push Q to get out of that. And now if I call our variable that's here on line 7 for body, I should get something a little bit more immediately usable. So does anybody have an idea of what I would do with this value that's stored in body? How would I like parse this data? Did anybody get far enough in your reading to find that? If not, that's okay. What would be, oh, go ahead, Andrew.
Was it the JSON.parse?
Yeah,
body?
exactly. And Andrew, do you have an idea of like can you go through why that would be useful versus just trying to parse this on its own? I think you're muted, Andrew.
Yeah,
Sorry.
it turns into a hash, does it not?
Right, exactly. And so I just wanted to point that out because just to like drive home the point that these are essentially JSON responses that are just essentially huge strings. And that's not super convenient to work with as it is now, but luckily we do have that JSON.parse, as Andrew told us, and we can parse that variable body and it does turn it into a hash. So now this is a lot more workable and readable and usable. And that's why we love JSON. So let me see, let me double check that there's nothing else here I wanted to talk about. Yeah, so that's about it for the tools and the concepts that I wanted to cover up to this point. The next thing that we'll be doing is taking some time to practice individually. There's this GitHub API endpoint that I've been using with my own GitHub username that's available in the lesson plan. And I'd like everybody to try to retrieve that info using Ruby and Faraday, using curl, and also using the web browser. And then once you've done that, this is all in the lesson plan. But go ahead and try to retrieve your number of followers, try to retrieve the date that you joined GitHub, and find some data of your choice. If you are working on this and you get through everything else and you're feeling pretty good about it, this might be a good time to go look at the little SD shop user stories for the API section and see if you can retrieve some of that data. And I'll walk through a quick example before we take a POM and then go out into our own individual study. I did see in the chat about the link to the slides. I can drop a link to the slides in your channel after we go out into our individual exploration time. Let's see real quick. So when I'm saying find like this particular resource or find this piece of data, that would be getting to the point that we've gotten here together, looking at this file and then doing something like body, and then maybe I want to find the bio. Oops. Oh, I didn't save that. So I'll say response body equals JSON.parse. Then I can say response body, and yeah, for this example, let's say location. And yeah, that's the process that I hope everybody has a chance to practice for these data points here. Any questions about what I'm asking y'all to do or about what we've covered so far? Alexa.
Could you just go over one more time how to access this in the actual web browser?
Yeah, absolutely. Give me 1 second here. I'm going to copy this link and send it into y'all's chat if that's okay. So y'all can have access to those slides. Let's go through accessing this in the browser again. I think for today, I'm going to stick with this example of this api.github.com. And we're just going to enter this into our browser like we would any other URL. And then, yeah, I'll go to Jameson Ordway. And that's really all there is to it. If you feel like exploring other APIs and seeing if you can, or other parts of the GitHub API and seeing what you can find in the browser, that's great. That's totally fine too. But the part of this that signals to me, just looking at it, that it's an API endpoint is the API in the domain api.github.com. And if you get to this page, I don't remember for sure. I think maybe if you don't have the JSON formatter extension, it'll look something more like this. But basically, you should be able to enter this URL or whatever URL you're working with, get to that endpoint and see that it's just a big hash blob. Is that helpful, Alexa?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Oh no, if we need access, I'm going to change that on in the docs, but if anybody has questions. No. Anyone. There we go. Okay. I think I did it right that time. Cool. Okay. Let's go ahead and build in a POM and come back at 10:05 and we'll go from there. And I'll be here in the room. I'll have my camera off, but if anybody has questions, we can work through some of this stuff together. Okay.
API rate limit exceeded. Is there a way around that, or?
Yeah, that wasn't actually something I expected to run into today, but I think if you just log in, your rate limit should be increased, and or it might be one of those things where we have to wait because it has to do with how many requests you're making in a certain time. So let me look into that real quick and I'll get you a solution. And if anybody else is running into rate limiting issues, let me know and we'll see if we can debug them together. Just give me a couple minutes.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Angel and anybody else who, if you do run into this rate limiting issue, this is what I would start to explore with our remaining time. If you go to docs.github.com, there's a section for authentication, and the basic authentication I think is most appropriate for today. I'm going to drop this link in our Zoom chat. There we go. And if you don't get all the way through this authentication process, and if most of the rest of your time is spent reading the docs, that's completely fine. I think that's a valuable experience, and we'll be getting more into authenticating and rate limiting and all those API concepts later on. So this is where I would start. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
No problem. All right, let's go ahead and come back together. And if y'all could turn on your videos as you come back as you are able, lets me know who's back. That's super helpful. Cool, thanks. All right, so that was a lot of time that we had to experiment and try things out. How did it go? Would anybody like to share something interesting that they learned or a place you got stuck? Floor is yours. Was everybody able to get through all the exercises up to, you know, finding some data of your choice? For some of the people who got through this a little bit quicker, was anybody able to like go find some of the data that you would need for Little SD Shop? Andrew, could you share your screen and show us what you found? And I saw your hand too, Alexa.
Yeah, so I like went into so for my repo,
Mhm.
I changed this to my repo and I did Faraday Git for like my api.github/repo/ my username / the project repo. And then I was like getting all this information here so I could get like the repo name. If I scroll up here, I can get my login, so my username, which the project was asking for.
Mhm.
Yeah, the name of the project. And then I was looking at like the collaborators here. So I was trying to find where I would like grab the information for the different collaborators because we need this kind of information for all of us. And I was getting a little stuck, but I didn't really get to try it. And I know that it had like a link here, like /collaborators and then /collaborator. And I wasn't sure what this was doing. And it was giving me like, when I tried to put this URL in here, it was giving me like a weird thing with like nothing found. And then I tried putting / one of my team members GitHub username in there and it still wasn't working. So
Gotcha. Out of curiosity, can you just go to collaborators like without that following slash, like in your browser?
yeah, I think it also wasn't working. I'm not sure.
Requires authentication. Yeah. That's cool. Thank you for sharing. That's a pretty cool endpoint that you found there. I think that you're on a really cool track, and this is, you know, the first step in exploring some of those endpoints that we'll be consuming in the projects. And also, like with this being an introductory lesson, I think a few people ran into things that will be easier once, you know, we're authenticated through GitHub, and, you know, things like rate limiting or needing authentication to see private information in your repo. It's really cool, Andrew. Thank you. Alexa, did you have something to share? Or a
Yeah,
question?
I actually have a question.
Sure.
So in the MVC world, where should JSON and an API connection live? Should it be in the model, the controller?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm glad you brought that up. That's a perfect segue into how I wanted to spend the next few minutes. So to preface, like, better patterns are coming as we do more lessons on APIs and read more material on API design and, you know, how to build those in ways that are easy to consume and easy to maintain, similar to how you would think about database design. And I don't want to give like a full, complete answer to that because it's a really good question, and I want to give everybody a chance to kind of discuss this. But I like that we're already thinking about it, right? If we move from consuming an API to designing and building an API, where does that logic live and whose responsibility is it? So I'm going to hold on giving a full answer for that. And because we've been working a lot independently this morning, I wanted to send people into breakout rooms in a second, I will, for about 10 minutes to go through some checks for understanding and just discuss. And it's okay if we don't know all the answers, but I would like that conversation to get going so that we can start challenging our understanding of how these APIs work and how we would design them. So yeah, good question. Kyle, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just curious if we were going to move into sort of like token access and authentication if that's in mod 3 or if we're going to get into that at the end of mod 2.
I believe that is going to be covered in mod 3. But but there might be some lighter material about it in I would have to double check. I think there, we look at our the project that everybody's working on right now. There's an extension. One of the Choose Your Own Adventure extensions, I believe, is an authentication authorization path. So that information is available, but it's not quite the focus yet. It'll be covered a lot more in Mod 3. Okay, are there any other questions that we can talk about now? I want to circle back to Alexa's question after we do these breakout rooms. Yeah, Alexa.
I'm just wondering, how do you know if you can API into a website, I guess? Like GitHub lets us, and then you can kind of follow the URLs from there. But I tried on some random websites and I would get like an authentication error or no message error. So I'm just wondering if there's a way to know what we can work with.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the go-to answer that I would have would be to check the individual documentation about the API that you're interested in, because while there are some best practices or some conventions when it comes to designing APIs, every company or every website, every application is probably going to organize their API slightly differently. So they might have a URI that signifies that it's an API endpoint. They might have different ways of organizing their resources in their path, and then they also might expose different sets of data. They might require you to authenticate, they might not. GitHub is an example of one that will make you authenticate pretty quickly or make you have some sort of login set up, but you can still experiment with some of the data or some of the API endpoints first. So I would say if there's a particular API you're interested in, just finding the documentation and going through any like setup guides that they have is a good place to start, because the results are going to vary depending upon the API.
Awesome, thank you.
Of course. Okay, so let's go ahead and take 10 minutes. If you look in the lesson plan at the very bottom, there's some checks for understanding. There's a question about how could you incorporate the GitHub API into a Rails application, and then some questions about the HTTP request response cycle as we understand it now. So I'm going to break you up into groups of, I think most of us will be groups of 4. And it's okay, like I think I mentioned, if we don't have all the answers to this right away, totally fine, we'll come back together and discuss. But I wanted you all to have a chance to get kind of the wheels turning and talking about these things, so that hopefully some of it sticks and makes more sense when we come back together. So let me open up those breakout rooms 1 second. And I think 10 minutes might be too long. Let's say 8 minutes. Yeah, and if you are struggling to find things to talk about or struggling to find the answers to these questions, I think a good way to spend time might be to look at the GitHub API and think about where it would make the most logical sense, like just discuss where it would make the most logical sense for that to live in your application. I think that discussion, I mean, that's a difficult problem in computer sciences, SRP. So discussing different ways that could look would be a valuable use of time, and then we'll share out when we come back together in about 8 minutes. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. So I wanted to go through some of these discussion questions together. Let's see, Jesus, what did your group talk about for this first check for understanding? How could you incorporate the GitHub API into a Rails application, and where could or should this functionality live?
We were looking throughout the whole folders and stuff, trying to figure out where it might go. So some of us were thinking it might live under the app part of it, and seems like some documentation was saying that it could also live in the controllers, but not sure
So we could, one option that we talked about, or that your group talked about, is just at the app, like basically the root level, or maybe at under app controllers, and then we have some controller that handles API stuff.
Yeah.
Cool.
got it.
Okay, thank you. Anybody have anything to add to that, or anything else their group discussed that could be an option? Chris?
Yeah, we also talked about, I mean, pretty much the controller as well, but also there's like specific routes. It looks like some people did that, like, you know, routes a specific controller just for doing API calls.
Cool. Yep, that makes sense to me too. Cool, thank you. Were there any other places that people talked about maybe incorporating this functionality? Let's see, what group have we not heard from? Trevor R, what did your group have anything different? Did y'all discuss anything different than like maybe doing something at the root level, controller?
We pretty much just kind of think had the same ideas. We were talking a little bit too about some people having some issues with curl and things, so we kind of talk about some of those too. But
That's cool.
I think generally we kind of had the same thoughts about where it would go.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks everybody for sharing. I really appreciate that people are thinking about SRP ahead of time and how this fits into the MVC paradigm. And like I had mentioned before, we'll have a lot of content that goes into more best practices and organization. But for now, where we can leave off is we do want this API functionality to have its own place to live in our app. And one thing that I'll mention today that we'll get into more detail later is service objects. So one way I guess we could think about this is if we think about a really big application, like, I don't know, Walmart or something, like they have a lot of stuff to do on the internet. They might break out their functionality even for the same website into, and I don't know if Walmart does this, don't quote me, but a big site like that might break out into microservices, right? Like this app connects to this other app and it's only responsible for inventory or whatever the case may be, right? We can scale that down and think about the same pattern in Rails applications as we have MVC. We have things that fit very neatly into our models and our controllers and into our views. But we also we have the capability to create objects that are not connected to the database that might have some other functionality related to our models. And this would be a good example of something that could go into a service object. So I just wanted to get the wheels turning there and kind of introduce that as an idea. We won't go into too much detail today, but yeah, thank you everybody for discussing that and sharing out. Let's hear from a group. I'll let y'all volunteer before I call on somebody, but let's hear from a group that talked about these questions, these checks for understanding. I'll go ahead and fill out, like we're talking, when we think about a web app and the things that we've been building so far, who's the client? Well, we think of the client as, the browser is the client. The server is an application, right? Or a server somewhere. Server is where we have our DB, et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me, I feel like I need to sneeze, but okay. The user, if we're looking at our web apps, a user is like a human being that's interacting with our website, right? We might also think of this as like a end user, somebody who's using the application to do something in their day-to-day life most of the time, right? And HTTP requests, more often than not, we're either using a URL in our browser, or we're using a like a form. And our HTTP responses are coming back to us in HTML, CSS, JavaScript, some pretty format that like a user can interact with and it looks like a website, but we know this is HTML, CSS, JavaScript, et cetera, right? As we move forward and start thinking about what all this looks like for a web API, I'd love to hear from some people who discussed in a web API, who is the client? Jake?
Client would be the actual application.
Yeah, like that. It's an application. This is how APIs are how apps talk to each other. We could consume an API in the browser like we did, but more often than not, these are designed for like a machine to be able to understand this data being passed back and forth, right? Awesome, thank you. Someone else, did you talk about who would the server be for a web API? Doug?
It would be the API request address, whoever server that is, or like GitHub in the example we were using.
Yeah, awesome. Exactly, another server / application. That is accessible, I would add here, add to what you said, Doug, because I'd like to emphasize, we have these two kind of concepts of a server. We have a server that we can go to. If we just go to github.com, that server is giving us all the assets and the functionality that we would use as just a user clicking on things on their site, versus their application and their server that's accessible to API users. Those are kind of separate concepts, right? But they work in a very similar way. Awesome. Who is the user of a web API? Any ideas? Kwa, what do you think?
The developer?
Yeah, exactly. It's a developer. We're no longer thinking about, in most cases, in this context, we're thinking about us as developers consuming APIs, or we're building, when we get towards building our own APIs, we're building them with a developer in mind, rather than, I don't know, a shopper for a store or whatever the case may be. Awesome. And then for these last two, I'll just say, or for this one here, I'll say these are very similar. Of course, it's going to be set up differently because we're working on the back end. We're not going into our browser and typing something out. But the point here is like the HTTP requests work the same way, and APIs are designed around HTTP. Ben, did you have a question or something to add?
Yeah, and so for the web API HTTP request, you're sending a request to the endpoint through a URL. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. Okay. So if we go through this example here on line 5, if y'all can see my atom, we're assigning the response from this request to a variable. So we're sending an HTTP request to this endpoint. And what this URL is determined by the people who make that API. And then we use something like in Ruby, we're going to use a lot of Faraday. We use something that will help us go hit that API. A lot of APIs that I've used personally have SDKs for Ruby, software development kits. So the syntax is really nice. You can just say something like API tool.get, very similar to how we're using Faraday and passing it a URL. So we're sending an HTTP request here, and then we're saving the response to do something with. That answer your question, Ben?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much.
Kyle?
Could you also use the Faraday tool to like make a post request to update data on an API or to create new data?
Yep. And I don't have like exact syntax or examples for Faraday handy, but that's a really good point, Kyle. We can do all the things that we can do with HTTP so long as those endpoints allow it. It's possible to post to these and get different responses. It's very common to get when you're consuming APIs. But yes, there are other verbs that you can use with Faraday and with other tools. That answer your question? Cool. Okay, I have one more here. When we're making these calls to API endpoints, what does the response look like? When we're in a web app, it's going to be HTML, CSS, and JavaScript most of the time. But what about for web APIs? Anybody have an idea? Genevieve? Do you have an idea of what the response would look like?
JSON?
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be JSON. And the reason for that being the computer doesn't need to know how to make any of this look pretty, right? When our APIs are talking to each other, or when we're getting our application to talk to another application, we're mostly or almost entirely focused on the exchange of data. So it's going to come back as JSON. It's the agreed upon format that's really easy for a variety of languages to handle and parse. Cool. So we're at 10:35. I don't have any other material in the lesson plan to get through today. We wrapped up a little bit earlier than I expected, but I'm happy to keep chatting about this stuff and answering questions, and I'll leave the room open for that. What I would recommend for the next, until 11, I would recommend taking a POM if you haven't taken a POM recently, and spending some more time just doing some exploration into the I think probably the GitHub API is the most helpful at this point, since it's something we're asking you all to use in your projects. So if you could take a POM sometime within the next 30 minutes and spend the rest of the time just doing some exploration or experimentation and or asking questions, I'll leave this room open until 11, and then y'all will have work time. I'll also share a reminder now to fill out the survey for today's lesson so that nobody forgets. Yeah, and that's it. I'll keep this room open in case people have questions, but does anybody have anything before, we kind of close and go into our own exploration time? Questions, thoughts, ideas, observations that you ran into? Okay. And I will stop screen sharing.